In August 1991, at the Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, surgeons faced a terrifying dilemma. A 35-year-old woman named Pam Reynolds had a brain tumor threatening to burst. The only way to save her was a procedure so extreme it required taking her right to the edge of biological death. To safely operate, the medical team lowered her body temperature to a freezing 16 degrees Celsius. They stopped her heart completely. They drained blood from her head, and brainwave activities ceased entirely. By every clinical definition, Pam was dead. To ensure her brain was completely unresponsive, the team took extreme precautions. They applied heavy surgical tape over Pam's eyes, keeping them sealed shut. They also inserted small speakers deep into her ear canals, blasting continuous, loud clicking sounds to block out any external noise. The surgery succeeded, but when Pam regained consciousness, she described things that should have been impossible. She vividly recalled observing the room from above. She described the exact shape of the surgical bone saw, comparing it to an electric toothbrush, and she repeated verbatim the unscripted dialogue between the surgeons operating on her open skull. This leaves a medical paradox. Her eyes were taped, her ears were blocked, her brain registered zero activity, yet she accurately perceived physical events in the room. How does a definitively brain-dead patient observe reality from outside her own body? Humanity has tried to answer this question for centuries. Across the globe, vast majorities hold a firm belief in an afterlife and a human soul. But modern science demands physical, measurable proof. The first serious attempt to capture that proof happened in 1901. Dr. Duncan McDougall built an enormous, highly sensitive scale inside an American hospital. He placed the cot of a dying tuberculosis patient onto the device, intending to physically weigh the human soul the exact moment it left the body. At the time of death, the scale registered a sudden drop of exactly 21 grams. The finding made global headlines, but medical critics quickly dismantled the study. They pointed out that the sudden weight loss was simply the evaporation of moisture and sweat from the lungs and skin as the body ceased functioning. McDougall's flawed methodology deeply embarrassed the scientific community. As a result, researchers largely abandoned the question. For over 70 years, mainstream science refused to touch the subject of life after death, leaving a massive gap in clinical research. That silence finally broke in 1975, when a researcher named Dr. Raymond Moody compiled 150 distinct interviews with patients who had survived clinical death. He coined a new term to legitimize their study, the near-death experience, or NDE. This animated diagram maps the chronological sequence Moody discovered. Despite coming from entirely different backgrounds, these patients reported the exact same chain of events. A flat line is followed by the sensation of moving through a dark tunnel, then standing outside the body, meeting deceased relatives, and finally experiencing a rapid review of their entire life. But look closely at the end of this sequence. The entities these patients encounter split based on what they were raised to believe. Western patients routinely describe meeting figures like St. Peter at pearly gates. In contrast, cases documented in India feature patients encountering Yamaraj, or celestial clerks checking ledgers, often realizing they brought the wrong person and sending them back. The visual details of the afterlife strictly conform to a person's local culture and childhood expectations. Because the setting of this other side changes depending on where you were born, researchers conclude these are subjective hallucinations constructed by the mind, rather than a single objective reality. Medical science operates on a concept called the dependence thesis. This states that every memory, feeling, and conscious thought is strictly tethered to physical brain activity. When the brain shuts down, the mind shuts down. Looking at this cross-section of the visual cortex helps explain the most famous symptom, the tunnel of light. Psychologist Susan Blackmore notes that our visual wiring has fewer cells on the periphery and more in the center. During oxygen starvation, those outer edge cells misfire and go dark first, leaving only a bright center. The brain interprets this shrinking aperture as a dark tunnel moving toward a light. As for the profound peace and the sudden flashing of memories, these are also mechanical responses. Extreme biological stress triggers massive dumps of endorphins, inducing deep tranquility. Simultaneously, oxygen deprivation causes seizures in the temporal lobe and limbic system, abruptly dumping stored memories into a rapid life review. What feels to the patient like a profoundly mystical journey to another realm is a predictable sequence of biological events. It is simply the experience of a complex organic machine in the process of shutting down. If these symptoms are strictly biological, they shouldn't only happen on a deathbed. We should be able to trigger them in perfectly healthy humans facing physical stress. The United States Navy inadvertently tested this on their fighter pilots. To prepare for extreme maneuvers, pilots are strapped into human centrifuges and spun at immense speeds. The violent centrifugal force pulls blood and oxygen directly out of the brain, inducing a state known as G-LOC, G-force-induced loss of consciousness. When the pilots wake up, they routinely report experiencing the exact same phenomena as dying hospital patients. They describe traveling through dark tunnels, seeing bright lights, and floating outside of their bodies, all entirely driven by sudden oxygen deprivation. Nobody in the centrifuge was dying, and no gates to the afterlife were opening. The out-of-body experience is a biological coping mechanism for a brain in crisis. It is a neurological illusion, not the literal detachment of a human soul. This neurological explanation is incredibly robust. It cleanly resolves nearly every reported case of near-death experiences. But then we return to the surgical file of Pam Reynolds, and the biological theory hits a wall. Biology easily accounts for Pam's feelings of peace and her visions of deceased relatives. It completely fails, however, to explain how a brain-dead patient, whose eyes were sealed shut with surgical tape, visually identified the exact shape of a custom bone saw she had never seen before. To capture hard data on anomalies like this, Dr. Sam Parnia launched the AWARE study across 15 hospitals. Researchers placed specific images on high shelves inside operating rooms, visible only from the ceiling. If patients floating out of their bodies were truly observing physical reality, they would be able to identify these hidden images upon waking. Over 2,000 cardiac arrest patients were studied. More than 100 were interviewed after resuscitation. While several reported out-of-body experiences, not a single patient was able to definitively identify the images hidden on the shelves. While medical science can confidently explain 99% of near-death experiences through neurochemistry, it still lacks an answer for that final 1%. Cases like Pam Reynolds leave a permanent, tantalizing crack in our certainty. Yet, despite all our clinical studies and historical obsessions, we arrive at one stark reality. No human has fully crossed the definitive border of biological death. Every patient who woke up was ultimately still tethered to this planet. The scientific method dictates that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. An unexplained medical anomaly during a complex surgery is a profound mystery, but it does not equate to verified proof of a spiritual afterlife. Without that guarantee of an afterlife, our perspective shifts. If we cannot be certain of what waits on the other side, we are compelled to treat this singular life on this physical earth as our only guaranteed opportunity to experience heaven.